Jesus is like astonished that Mary and Joseph are coming to look for him when they know that he is the Messiah, when they know that he is 12 years old, considered to be a man that needs to start learning his father's business. So Jesus is like, why did you look for me? Like, didn't you realize I'd be here beginning to learn my father's business? Hey, faithful listeners, sit back and enjoy this episode today about the only story we hear of with Jesus' growing up years, which is mentioned here in Luke chapter 2. So stay tuned for this episode. Hey, faithful listener, grab your cup of coffee and experience the Bible in a way you never have before. P40 Ministries is a podcast that goes through the Bible cover to cover. It's an awesome narrative that focuses your mind and prepares your heart for God to speak. So join your host, Jen, for a biblical podcast that's hilarious, informative, imaginative, and fun. The P40 Ministries podcast. Listen now as we go through the book of Luke. Hello and good morning, faithful listeners. Happy Tuesday, and thanks for tuning in to the P40 Ministries podcast, the podcast that brings you a consistent Bible reading routine every weekday. And the point of the podcast is to help you understand the relatability of the Bible in the modern day. So, I'm doing a giveaway right now, and I hope you guys continue to enter. And it's $55 worth of stuff that I am giving away. I'm giving away one of my Out of the Mire devotionals and also one of the Lion of Judah teas. So if you want to be entered into that giveaway, all you have to do is go over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the podcast. Then just send a screenshot of your rating and review over to Jen, Jenn, at p40ministries.com, and you will be entered in the giveaway. So it's super simple to enter, and you can possibly win something really cool. So definitely enter and tell people that this giveaway is happening as well. So let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 2, verses 39 through 52. This right here is a really fun portion of Luke chapter 2 because this is the only story in the Bible that talks about Jesus' growing up years. So let's see what Luke has to say. I'll be reading out of the WEB as always. When they had accomplished all things that were according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee, to their own city Nazareth. The child was growing, and he was becoming strong in spirit, being filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. His parents went every year to Jerusalem at the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Joseph and his mother didn't know it, but supposed him to be in the company. They went a day's journey, and they looked for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they didn't find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the middle of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When they saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I were anxiously looking for you." He said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my father's house?" They didn't understand the saying which was spoken to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth. He was subject to them, and his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and men. So Matthew gives a little bit of context into Jesus' birth a little bit more. Matthew talks about the Magi that came and visited, and also about everything that happened with King Herod and how he tried to kill baby Jesus from a young age. And so his parents actually lived in Egypt for a short amount of time until King Herod had died. Then his parents and Jesus moved up to Nazareth, and they lived there in Nazareth. So now, after all that happened in the book of Matthew, we see Luke jumping to this story, and this is after Joseph and Mary and Jesus all came back from Egypt and were living in Nazareth. It says that basically the child was growing up in verse 40 and was becoming strong in spirit, being filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. So every single year, when Passover happened, God had commanded in Exodus that all the men of the children of Israel were supposed to come before God in whatever designated place that was. So the tradition in Jesus' time was that I believe it was within 15 miles. So any man that lived within 15 miles had to make the trip into Jerusalem. I don't know if that was like biblical or not, according to Exodus, but that was what was done in Jesus' day. So Joseph would make this trip every single year on Passover, and he would make this trip into Jerusalem with his family. And this would have been a huge, huge thing. Like this would have been tons of relatives coming together to make this trip together, tons of acquaintances. This would have been like huge families traveling together to go into Jerusalem and have the Passover supper. So this kind of shows the dedication. We see that they followed the law as well as they possibly could. Like we just see that about Mary, especially with what we were talking about last time on, I think it was Thursday. And we see that with Joseph when he's making this journey into Jerusalem for the Passover supper. So Jesus's earthly parents were law followers, which I think is important to note. But moving on, it says here when Jesus was 12 years old, his parents and everybody went into Jerusalem for the Passover supper. As it says, according to the custom of the feast. And so they had to spend probably about a week there in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover. And it says that as they decided to go home after about a week and the Passover was completely finished, it says that Mary and Joseph left without Jesus. So Jesus would have been 12 years old. And that was primarily about the time in this culture when boys were starting to be considered men. They would start to learn the trade of their fathers. They would start to learn how to provide for their families. And this was the time, I think, even when schooling was finished, but I'm not quite sure about that, so don't quote me on that one. But at this point, boys were becoming men. And right now, we kind of look at that age as like 18 in our culture. But back in these days, it was 12 because men and women got married younger. It was just more common to have stuff done at a younger age. So Jesus, being 12 years old, which is considered to be like the manhood time, I suppose, stays behind in Jerusalem and doesn't go back with his family. So Mary and Joseph think that Jesus is just in this company of people that's traveling back into Nazareth with them. But they don't realize that Jesus isn't there because they have all their acquaintances, they have all their cousins, they have all their sisters and brothers and whoever else with them, as well as acquaintances and friends, anybody that chose to travel up with them. This could have been a huge bunch of people traveling. And it says that they were traveling for about a day before they realized that Jesus was not there with them. So now Joseph and Mary are freaking out because Jesus is nowhere to be found. And probably at this point, Joseph and Mary had had other children as well. So it sounds to me like Joseph and Mary took all their kids and traveled back to Jerusalem to look for the Messiah. And the other thing was, since Jesus would have been considered almost like a man age at this point, maybe they were giving Jesus more freedom to kind of do what he wanted at that point in time. Maybe they're like, oh, he's the Messiah. He's not going to have anything happen to him. Like he has God's special blessing on him. Who knows what Mary and Joseph thought, but they were giving some leeway to Jesus, and Jesus decides to stay back in Jerusalem. So of course, Mary and Joseph freak out because Jesus is nowhere to be found. And I remember one time when I was a little kid, I got separated from my mom in a store, And my mom freaked out. She freaked out. She was screaming across the store, Jen, Jen. So parents get really scared when their kids are not with them, obviously. And same thing here happens with Mary and Joseph. So they travel back into Jerusalem, possibly with their kids, looking for Jesus. So they were searching for 3 whole days. They were probably horrified. So finally on the 3rd day, they go into the temple and there's Jesus, and he's sitting in the middle of all of these teachers and these scribes and these Pharisees, and he's listening to them and he's asking them questions, and he's literally like teaching the teachers in a way. And it says that everyone who was standing around Jesus was amazed at this young boy's answers and his understanding. So this just shows that Jesus was a special, special boy who understood his relationship with his heavenly Father very, very well, even at such a young age. And I don't know when Jesus started having this understanding, but it probably was from a very young age. And I'm sure that Mary and Joseph understood that Jesus was the Messiah as well. In fact, I know that they did. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but their understanding of the Messiah was very, very different from what our understanding of the Messiah is now. Like I've said several times before, they believed the Messiah was going to be a great earthly king who conquered the nations almost to give Israel its glory back, more of a political leader, rather than what Jesus really came to do, which was to die for humanity and pay the price of sin so that you and I can go to heaven someday. And that was Jesus's real purpose, but people didn't understand that back then. But they did know that the Messiah was going to be a very, very special person who had God's favor on him. That's what they knew the Messiah was. But so now Jesus is sitting there in the middle of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And the teachers are just like awestruck by this young boy that's like giving perfect answers and stuff. So then Mary and Joseph go up to Jesus and they're like astonished seeing Jesus like doing this. And Mary's like, son, why have you treated us like this? Isn't that a mom thing to do? Okay, son, why have you treated us this way? Your father and I were anxiously looking for you. So then Jesus is like quizzical, and he's just like, why were you looking for me? He's like, didn't you know that I have to do my father's business? And I believe that is what the Greek word actually says. The WEB translated as the father's house. But the Greek, I believe, says the father's business. So once again, 12-year-old boys would begin to learn their father's business at this point in time. Jesus, of course, was talking about his heavenly Father. And so Jesus is like astonished that Mary and Joseph are coming to look for him when they know that he is the Messiah, when they know that he is 12 years old, considered to be a man that needs to start learning his father's business. So Jesus is like, why did you look for me? Like, didn't you realize I'd be here beginning to learn my father's business? And it says in verse 50 that Mary and Joseph didn't understand why Jesus said that. They didn't understand that. And that kind of goes back to the understanding of the Messiah back in these days. You know, Mary and Joseph and basically everybody else just didn't understand who the Messiah was. They knew that the Messiah was special, but they didn't understand why he was special. So Mary and Joseph are just like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Come back with us. Like, what are you doing? So it says that Jesus was subject to them. So he stops what he's doing at 12 years old. And it says that he goes down with them to Nazareth. So he immediately leaves, even though in Jesus's mind, he was doing the right thing. He was beginning to learn how to do his heavenly Father's business, but he goes and he becomes subject to his earthly parents. And it says that his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. This is the second or third time that Luke mentions this. Mary was like constantly processing what was going on with Jesus. And I believe that is why Mary became a Jesus follower after Jesus was resurrected from the dead and went up to heaven. Mary became a Jesus follower and possibly even one of the evangelists and early church starters. And I think that's because, during this time, she was keeping these things, everything that was said to her from the time Jesus was a little baby. She was keeping all these sayings in her heart and everything that was going on and thinking about it and processing it to realize who the Messiah really was going to be. So then it says in verse 52 that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature. So in other words, he was growing up and he increased in wisdom during all this time and in favor with God and with men. So Jesus was kind of loved by all, it sounds like. He was becoming more and more wise. He was sinless. He never did anything wrong. And he was growing in favor with God, his heavenly Father, and also with his family and everybody else. So I think that when we delve into the history of the culture at this time period, we can kind of see what happened here of Jesus as a young boy really processing, he's supposed to go and do what other little boys are doing, which is learning their father's trade, and yet becoming so flustered almost when Mary and Joseph come to look for him. So I think that that's really funny and cute. So we're going to move into Luke chapter 3 on Thursday and talk a little bit about John the Baptist. And Luke doesn't mention John the Baptist too much, but we'll see what Luke has to say about John, a very interesting character. But friends and faithful listeners, go and do that giveaway. Rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and then just send me a screenshot of your rating and review to Jen, 2 N's, JENN at p40ministries.com. You'll be entered to win. Friends and faithful listeners, have a fantastic rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.